Howdy, and this is the second part of the video on cybersecurity terminology. So this is our third video for the week, but it's the second on this. We have 3 videos on cybersecurity terminology. And as always, we are waiting for the system to move this down. So here's a couple of points about cyber attacks. As the sophistication has increased over time, the attacker knowledge needed is actually gone down. And by that, I mean this. We have, in the old days, quote the old days when I first got into this, cyber attacks were nuisances. The Morris worm, the Anna Kournikova virus, the I love you virus. You would get an email and someone would have on the header, I love you, and you would open it up and it would install malware, Anna Kournikova, want to see a picture of Anna Kournikova, click on it and it would send this out to all of your contacts. The Morris worm brought down the internet at the time, but the long range, no money was stolen, no property was damaged. It was annoying. Well, unfortunately, our attacks have sophisticated to where they are on cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, stealing intellectual property, doing all kinds of bad things. But the actual knowledge that you need has decreased. It sounds like, wait, that couldn't be right. Did I hear that right? Now you can architect attacks and go to the dark web and buy some pieces, and it's a very agnostic. I call it the capitalism of cyber attacks because it's all about making money. And I'll sell you some stuff, you buy some stuff from somebody else, you put together an attack, that's it. And I don't care what you're going to do with it. You're going to use my piece of software and bring down medical devices, and you may kill children as long as I get my Bitcoin. So this sophistication, while increased, as attacker knowledge has decreased, given us that we always like to see these, movie things of the elite hackers. They're actually a very small percentage. I've only known a handful in my life that are truly elite. Script kiddies are the most of them. Script kiddies, you tell them a vulnerability, and or you give them something to do, and they can read the script and they do it. Hackers and script writers can find the vulnerabilities and write the scripts. The elite hackers are those that can introduce the vulnerabilities, that can really go out and discover this, that can figure out the nefarious ways to work. The exact delineation isn't that important in this class. If you were taking my foundations class, it would. But what is important is just knowing there aren't that many really smart hackers out there, really brilliant hackers like the movies make. Most of them is just, I'm going to engage some people who want to feel good about themselves, engage them in an attack, and they may not even know the ramifications or benefit from it. So what do hackers want and why do we care? Well, money, that's criminal. Disrupted operations may be attacks on our critical infrastructure. Notoriety is just saying, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me, right? Hacktivism, maybe those people who decide to blow up or to do some kind of attack on an oil refinery or something and actually have unintended consequences and do more damage to the environment. Sometimes it's just revenge, and sometimes it's just for fun. And why this is important in law and policy is the attribution of attacks often begins with, what were they after? And you can trace it back. Because what you'll find in this class is if an attacker is an individual or an entity, the rules of law apply. If it's a nation state, the rules of engagement apply. The rules of engagement used to be called the rules of war, okay? So what are they attacking? Well, they're using bad passwords, unpatched systems, they're using social engineering, insider threat is a big one, and then these phishing and spear phishing attacks. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these terms. But here's what we want to look at. Look at the consequence of the attack. This is where you begin to see about policy coming in. It's one thing to damage information in information systems. If you know the Shamoon attack that occurred in Saudi Arabia, which is still the largest attack on attack on the largest corporate entity, the Aramco, they had 30,000 machines that they couldn't bring back up. They had to basically, the story I heard was take them out in the desert and put a flamethrower. They had to completely replace the infrastructure in the world's largest corporation, losing millions of dollars a day. It was a nation-state attack. Saudi Arabia, rightfully or wrongly, attributed it to Iran. Then you have regulatory fines and penalties and also legal fees. In other words, big money you're going to pay. Regulatory fines, for instance, if in, I think it was 2011, Facebook signed a consent decree with the FTC that they would take better care of privacy of their customers. If the FTC invoked that now, and keep in mind, Facebook didn't break any laws. It was just considered a bad consumer practice by a regulatory agency. Each violation would be $40,000. So under the Cambridge Analytica attack, the total fines, if the FTC chose to, would be over $1 trillion. Would Facebook out of business? So you can have big regulatory fines and penalties. One of the reasons HIPAA has become more successful is at one time the fines were minimal. And then the fines began to be based on the actual number of records that were breached in healthcare. You can have decreased productivity, which leads to decreased profits. You can read this list, and here's why. One thing we talk about in law in civil suits is damages. And there's a lot of elements that goes into calculating damages, which we'll talk about. But one of the things about damages is how much are you going to have to pay to make me whole again? What is the actual damage you've done to me? So we talk about these principles. You can't get total security. It's all based on risk. I would suggest that you all take a risk course, a cybersecurity risk course. There's a new risk management framework out this week from NIST, which I would love to show you if their website was up, that takes security. Yeah, we've always had that. Privacy. Yeah, we've always had that. And ding, 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 supply chain risk. So absolute security is unachievable. You're going to make a business case. If I can get 95% there and it costs me $10 million, but to get 98% there, it's going to cost me $30 million. Depending on who I am, what my circumstances are, I might opt to say I'm going to take the risk. I might opt to say I got to spend the money to take less risk. Then we've talked about CIA, but there's also authentication, authorization, auditability, and non-repudiation. We will talk about these. The objectives are CIA, but we also have to realize that the mechanisms are in red, are these authentication, authorization, auditability, non-repudiation, which are often conflated with the objectives. Security is only as strong as the weakest link, right? And when I talk about this, we need to keep up that security isn't just electronics. It's not just firewalls and intrusion detection systems and strong passwords. It's physical security. So what good does it have for you to have all the security in place if your doors are unlocked, or you don't have a visitor's log and someone gets into your facility with unauthorized access? So security is only as strong as the weakest link. And you will see this reflected when you talk about the security principles. And then people tend to make poor security decisions. Okay, so you'll hear a lot about security design, and one thing I want to notice about this slide is the reference. This goes back to 1975, okay, before the internet, before, apps on your phone, heck, before cell phones, right? Least privilege. Least privilege, these security design privileges were also true in a more physical world than we have today. Least privilege says you get the least amount of access, the least amount of privilege, as do your role. If they are if a person is the receptionist in the company, then they don't have access to payroll. Separation of privilege means you take and give one person this access or one person another piece of access, or sometimes you do this electronically with systems, software, whatever. But the fact is, if one gets compromised or one is a bad actor, you've got the privilege separated. In a physical world, this would be the person who invoices isn't the person who collects and deposits the money in a company, because you don't want someone invoicing and being responsible for collecting the money in being the same person, because they could do bad things and there would be no way to easily detect that. Fail-safe defaults means just that. If you're going to fail in a state that is the least risk to health and safety. Economy and mechanism, keep it simple. We're all cyber fatigued. We are all cyber fatigued. We're tired of it. I've had so many credit cards breached. So many things have happened. Get a call that my credit card's being used in Cancun while I'm, sitting in Houston. I'm glad my credit card is having a good time, but my credit card's actually in my wallet. And it goes on and on. Open design means we're going to tell you how things are done. So now when you have to interact with it, you can better integrate with us, and possibly that can work against us. Least common mechanism, then psychological acceptability, these kind of things. I'm not worried so much in the terms as you begin to understand and see how these are used. Basically, we're talking about secure design. And this is important because you'll see when we talk about the EU, European Union's new law, General Data Protection Regulation, which has been in effect a little less than a year at this time, that they want security in the design. The initial design has to have security built in. And then there's defense in depth, which just means I'm going to put in different layers. They've got locks on the doors. You've got this, you've got that. You've got firewalls, but once you get through the firewalls, you've got an intrusion protection system. I'm still encrypting my data, with the idea being that if something breaks, you can get in. Now you might be wondering, wait a minute, we're talking about cybersecurity. Well, we got to know these definite words. And often in court cases, you'll see where they said, well, you only have one security mechanism in place. You were put yourself at enormous risk, and your liability or whatever is increased. Diversity of defense, mix it up, make sure it's electronic, make sure you train your people, your processes. Encapsulation means if you have an overarching standard, it encapsulates everything underneath, or an overarching protocol, it encapsulates everything underneath. Isolation is just that, isolate as much as you can. And trust relationships is talking about how you build trust in systems. So if you send a transaction back and forth, how do you build in those mechanisms to ensure that that relationship is in fact trustful, that you know who you're sending that money to, right? That you know when you get that request, it's the right request. That's going to end this video. Stay tuned for video 3.